Good morning. The committee will come to order. We thank everyone for being here. Special thanks to our witnesses who have taken time away from their busy schedules to be here with us today. We're here today to follow up on the June hearing held by our subcommittee on economic growth, tax, and capital access. In that hearing, we laid out many systematic problems within the IRS that are harming small businesses, including burdensome regulations, poor communication, and overly aggressive audits. Today, we are focusing specifically on the IRS audits and how small businesses are treated, and often mistreated, during that process. Members of this committee regularly hear from constituents about the IRS, and these constituents are not calling us to tell us what a great job the IRS is doing generally. They're calling because they are desperate and frustrated, and they have good reason to be on oftentimes. I know members of this committee have heard from constituents who were audited so aggressively by the IRS that they had to actually close their doors. Others are engaged in protracted audits that seem like vague fishing expeditions with no end in sight. Most are hindered in their ability to actually run their businesses because endless document demands from the IRS require so much of their time and resources. In many cases, small businesses simply cannot afford to hire a professional to deal with the demands of an audit. The IRS has an obligation to provide small businesses with clarity and to treat all taxpayers with fairness and respect. The agency has failed repeatedly in meeting this obligation of the people it is supposed to be serving. I don't need to tell you that a business that is forced to close its doors can no longer pay taxes. It also cannot hire employees and create economic growth in that community. Our current system is working oftentimes against these small businesses when it should be working for them. The IRS must do better. Today, we will be examining some of the issues and problems with the current exam process. We will also be exploring some possible solutions. And I'm looking forward to hearing from all of our witnesses here today, and I'd now like to yield to the ranking member, Ms. Adams, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this valuable hearing, which follows up on the Subcommittee on Economic Growth, Tax, and Capital Access hearing held in June. During that hearing, there was testimony from several witnesses about the difficulties associated with a tax audit. While tax audits serve an important purpose in the IRS role to enforce and collect taxes, the auditing process can be confusing and intimidating for small business owners. As we all know, our tax code is complex, resulting in simple and innocent mistakes which should not be met with a time-consuming and costly audit. However, audits do serve an important purpose. They are the primary tool used by the IRS in its effort to reduce the tax gap, which is caused by non-filing, underreporting, and underpayment. In total, the gap is over $450 billion, even with voluntary compliance at 84%. This lost revenue is unacceptably high, but because of IRS enforcement actions like audits, an additional $50 billion is recovered. The recovery of this amount proves just how important audits can be, but it should not come at the expense of our nation's job creators. Rather, the IRS should be tasked with doing all that they can to improve voluntary compliance before audits are required. Working with the taxpayer to correct mistakes is quintessential to a thriving tax system. Accordingly, the IRS has made strides to improve its relationship with taxpayers through increased customer service and outreach. Yet, improvements can always be made. Today's hearing will give us another opportunity to learn what enhancements can be performed and modifications made to auditing techniques to reduce the burden on small business owners. These recommendations are critical to improving tax compliance and closing the tax gap. They also serve a very important purpose in assisting small firms. We often hear reports of small employers closing doors due to an audit. They just couldn't recover from the process or the expense. In many cases, the owner's energy is shifted from maintaining or growing the businesses toward meeting IRS demands to substantiate records. This problem is compounded by that of the great financial costs of hiring an outside professional, which many businesses do when facing an audit. Such burden makes it essential to understand how the IRS's primary collection tool, audits, impacts a small business who's attempting to comply with complex rules. While a small employer has a duty to pay taxes and keep an efficient record-keeping system, the IRS also owes a duty to that taxpayer to conduct the audit in a manner which is clear, ensure the employer understands his rights or her rights during an audit, and to prevent harming the small business from aggressive tactics. So I look forward to learning more about the auditing process and what we can do to help both the IRS modify and update its practices and small business taxpayers do a better job by complying and record keeping. And so I'd like to thank the witnesses today for the time that they're taking out from their busy schedules to testify. And thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back, and I'd now like to explain kind of our timing rules here. And before that, committee members who may have opening statements, we'd ask that they submit them for the record. We operate under the 5-minute rule. You'll each get 5 minutes to testify. We take 5 minutes to ask questions, and there's a lighting system to assist you. The green light will be on for 4 minutes, and then the yellow light will be on for a minute to let you know that you've got about a minute to go, and then the red light will come on, and if you can stop, near that time, we'd appreciate it. We'll give you a little time, but not a whole lot. And I would now like to introduce our very distinguished panel here this morning. Our first witness is Kathy Protonchak, who is Director of the IRS Practice and Procedure for Alliant Group in Houston, Texas. In that capacity, she provides advisory assistance on a wide range of issues related to IRS procedures and represents clients before the IRS. Ms. Petronchek previously had a 29-year career with the IRS in various positions, most recently serving as Commissioner for the Small Business Self-Employed Division. And we welcome you here and appreciate your testimony. And our second witness will be Warren Hudak, President, Hudak & Company in Lemoyne, Pennsylvania. Hudak & Company is a small business that provides comprehensive tax services to other small businesses. Mr. Hudak is an enrolled agent and CPA and has owned Hudak & Company for the last 20 years. And we welcome and appreciate your testimony this morning, Mr. Hudak. Our third witness today is Don Wilson, Executive Director of the Kogod Tax Policy Center, Kogod School of Business at American University. Professor Williamson teaches a number of subjects related to taxation. He is also a partner in LaMonica and Williamson, a small Falls Church, Virginia firm that specializes in accounting, auditing, and tax preparation for small businesses. And we thank you for being here this morning. And I would now like to yield to our ranking member for the introduction of our final witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Jennifer Breen. Ms. Breen is a partner at Morgan Lewis, where she concentrates on tax controversy and planning matters with an emphasis on audits and IRS administrative proceedings. Before joining Morgan Lewis, she worked at Mattel, Inc., PricewaterhouseCoopers, and as a lawyer with the IRS Office of Chief Counsel. She received her Juris Doctorate from the University of Houston Law Center. Welcome, Ms. Breen.
We welcome Ms. Breen. And Ms. Petronchak, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Chabot and Ranking Member Adams, thank you for inviting me to testify. It is an honor to provide comments today for your hearing. I interact with small businesses in my work with Alliant Group, a tax consulting firm that ensures small and mid-sized businesses are able to avail themselves of the tax benefits provided by Congress. I also spent almost 29 years at the IRS and feel this gives me a unique perspective into the examination process. My testimony focuses on challenges that small businesses face and what the IRS can do to improve the examination process. Before I go into specifics, let me just say that much of the problem we see today is exacerbated by a lack of adequate funding for the IRS, a trend that needs to change. With respect to the IRS exam process, we believe there is some inconsistent treatment of small versus large businesses, as well as different procedures being used in audits of these businesses. It is important to remember that America's small businesses have needs, interests, and resources that may differ significantly from those of larger businesses. However, some of the procedures utilized in large business audits, as outlined in my testimony, provide added transparency that would bring greater fairness to the small business examination. I raised 5 issues in my testimony. I'd like to briefly focus on 2 of those issues: specialist assistance and third-party contacts. With regards to the first issue of specialist assistance, in an IRS audit, there are instances when specialists are needed. While this assistance is necessary, the process is often mysterious, and the taxpayer is left in the dark regarding who is making decisions. Our experience includes situations where a revenue agent who lacks expertise may rely on a technical specialist to make the decision in an examination. And due to staffing levels, the specialist may not have adequate time to fully assist, so revenue agents have only consultations with them. In some cases, the taxpayer is not aware that this has occurred or has not had an opportunity to discuss specialist's technical conclusions. My firm has encountered situations in which the taxpayer did not know this assistance happened until a FOIA request was made in preparation for appeals. Another recent experience creates a greater concern. We recently encountered a case in which the agent told our client that he was going to sustain a majority of the tax credit at issue. However, the agent then told our client he had to have a technical specialist review his final report. Weeks later, the agent told us that the specialist had directed him to allow little of the tax credit. The agent's manager informed us that he did not have the authority to reverse the specialist's decision, and when a conference call was requested with these technical specialists, we were advised that they would not participate. This behavior is particularly troublesome if the specialist is making the ultimate decision. The ideal situation is where the taxpayer is aware that a specialist is assigned and has access to that individual. The second issue I want to address is third-party contacts. The IRS often reaches out to third parties that are not under audit, but who may have needed information on the audited taxpayer. Such contacts are permitted in certain circumstances, but the IRS must give the taxpayer reasonable notice. We are seeing increased use of questionable third-party contacts. In our experience, it appears the IRS is increasingly using these contacts when they already have the information, and other times when they haven't, as required, first requested the information from the taxpayer. The IRS seems reckless in its third-party contacts, disregarding the adverse impact on the business of the taxpayer, as the IRS tells customers, vendors, former employees, and others that it is examining the taxpayer. This trend has been noticed by others doing IRS oversight. The National Taxpayer Advocate, in her 2015 annual report to Congress, raises a number of points, including that the IRS is not always effective in providing notice to taxpayers. Oftentimes, only providing them publication 1, your rights as a taxpayer, at the beginning of the exam, and not at or anywhere near the date of a third-party contact. The practice of issuing third-party contacts should be modified to ensure notice and an opportunity to respond prior to the time a third-party contact is to actually be initiated. In closing, I commend the committee for its work and oversight in ensuring that small businesses receive fair treatment and good service from the IRS, and Alliant Group looks forward to working with the committee to further improve tax administration.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hudak, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Chabot, Ranking Member Adams, members of the House Small Business Committee.
You might want to pull that mic down just a little bit. There you go. Thanks.
I was thanking everyone for the invitation today.
Sure.
My firm provides comprehensive tax services, including tax preparation, planning, and representation before the IRS. We work with all categories of small business, sole proprietors, partnerships, and S corporations. Our representation services include audits, negotiating installment agreements, offers and compromise, collection due process hearing appeals, and penalty abatements. Today, I share with you my perspective, and I participate here on behalf of the National Association of Enrolled Agents. Over the last 5 years, we have witnessed a significant shift in the number of and quality of IRS audits. This shift has coincided with a dramatic decrease in funding. We, too, have seen the quality of audits go down with the funding. In short, the agency is starting to rely more on automated and faceless decisions based on less on field audits and many on just scrubbing of information, third-party information. Importantly, IRS examinations range from simple issuance of IRS notice asking for clarification of a single item, but oftentimes that leads to unintended consequences, the runaway audit that was mentioned earlier. As sources dwindled, we've seen that increase in techniques. For instance, 1099-Ks. We recently had a client who was triggered an audit because their revenue that they reported didn't coincide with the 1099-K. They had an entity change during the course of the year, had 2 entities, and properly reported all income on both entities. Once that was presented to the auditor, inside of a very short period of time, in 5 minutes, the auditor was satisfied that all of the income was reported within IRS tolerances. But that didn't stop. It turned into a 6-month audit with requests from third parties and prejudicing the interests of the client for their ability to have privacy. There seems to be more and more of a culture of a win-win culture for the IRS. It's not to get at the actual correct tax, but the maximum tax. A recent call with the IRS, we had presented a rev proc to them to abate a penalty. Before I could even get the words rev proc out, they said, we have it, and they accomplished the task. When asked, why don't you offer this to other taxpayers when they call in, they said, we don't want to lead the customer. And that was a problem. Why isn't the IRS, in these terms, being more helpful? Why aren't they making them aware of the provisions of the code to allow them to comply with the law in the best interest of the taxpayer? Why would it be always the best interest of the government maximizing revenue? Training does make a difference. Increasingly, we're finding requests for things outside of the scope of the audit, and we have forced audits into appeals to allow us the latitude of a fresh, independent look. Many of our clients come to us after there's a controversy, and what we find is at that point in time, they are under the misguided impression that the IRS is there to assist them and represent them. And that leads me to really my closing. The Taxpayer Bill of Rights is an awesome, awesome law. It would clear up a lot of the problems we have in the audit. Along with the Pledge of Allegiance, the IRS agents, when they get up in the morning, should recite the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. Nina Olson in the Taxpayer's Office did an awesome job in advocating for that. She deserves all the credit in the world for accomplishing that. For small business and audits and compliance, we really should have more safe harbors, like the home office deduction. That was incredible. It simplified the record keeping, and quite frankly, you're probably collecting close to the right amount of revenue. Training and the IRS's future state, we're so excited about, but we want to be cautious. To my earlier comment, with the IRS's future state during that taxpayer interaction online, at some point during that interaction, we have to be careful that the IRS is not their representative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Williamson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Shabbat, Ranking Member Adams, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the issues small businesses confront when they are audited by the Internal Revenue Service. My name is Don Williamson, and I'm a professor of taxation at American University's Kogod School of Business, where for the past 32 years, I have been the director of the school's Master's in Taxation program. And for the past 27 years, I've had my own tax preparation and tax planning practice, LaMonica and Williamson CPAs, in Falls Church, Virginia, which specializes in representing small businesses and their individual owners before the Internal Revenue Service. Mr. Chairman, the majority of small business audits are conducted by correspondence. While this approach may work, when a taxpayer has failed to report income reported to the Internal Revenue Service by third parties on Form 1099s, problems arise when the IRS is seeking verification of or more detail about the information on the return itself. In these cases, taxpayers' written responses to notices often sit at the IRS processing centers for months until assigned to an auditor. The auditor will often find the taxpayer's response to be insufficient, setting off a new round of correspondence, consuming yet several more months. Furthermore, because small business owners usually rely upon enrolled agents, CPAs, or attorneys when they are contacted by the IRS, significant costs arise for even insignificant inquiries, such that many business owners simply concede to a proposed adjustment and opt to pay the extra tax. These problems were most recently illustrated in my own practice, where a client living in Texas was contacted by the IRS Philadelphia Center regarding the income and expenses claimed on his Schedule C. The letter did not provide the name of any person at the IRS to contact and simply requested copies of all the taxpayer's books and records. The taxpayer, at considerable cost of time and professional fees, assembled the requested information in large boxes, which were mailed to the address requested. After 4 months, the client received a one-page letter with an attached page statement declaring the taxpayer's business was a hobby, resulting in a substantial proposed assessment of tax, interest, and penalties. At that point, my client had already incurred substantial fees in responding to the initial request for information, and I frankly advised him that taking the matter to the appeals division would cost even more. Nevertheless, my client insisted that I file a protest showing that his business was not a hobby. After several more months and several letters, where I was able to transfer the case from Philadelphia to the appeals office in Texas, where the taxpayer resides, we received yet another letter asking again for a complete copy of all the taxpayer's travel and entertainment expenses, with schedules reconciling the individual expenses to the totals on the return, documentation which we had already provided. Nevertheless, we again began to prepare new schedules, cross-referencing each receipt to the totals on the return. However, before we could complete the work, the client received a one-paragraph letter dropping the case. As a result of this exercise that lasted for almost a year, the client incurred professional fees that exceeded the initial adjustment in tax proposed by the IRS had he not contested the matter. The substantial cost of this case, not only to the taxpayer, but indeed to the IRS itself, illustrates the limits of correspondence audits. Because most correspondence audits initially have no point of contact at the IRS to discuss the matter, taxpayers and their representatives simply hope they are providing the correct information. At the very least, the IRS must better facilitate the internal tracking of correspondence audits and end the practice of courtesy disconnects when a taxpayer is on hold for more than 45 minutes when calling the IRS. In addition, IRS should consider assigning a case to an auditor if the taxpayer requests such an assignment at the time of first contact. Finally, if the IRS can significantly improve its online capabilities, and more importantly, its security over its online functions, taxpayers could respond to email communications with specific IRS personnel. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to working with the committee on this critical problem of tax administration.
Thank you very much. Ms. Breen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation today to discuss the IRS's approach to the audits of small business taxpayers. My name is Jennifer Breen, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Administrative Practice Committee of the American Bar Association Section on Taxation. I'm also a partner with the law firm of Morgan, Lewis & Bockius, where I represent taxpayers before the Internal Revenue Service in audits and appeals. I'm here today on behalf of the ABA tax section, and so my testimony today should not be construed as representing the policies of the larger association. In the IRS's 2015 fiscal year, it closed approximately 1.3 million examinations, of which over 300,000 were examinations of small business returns. The audits of these small businesses were conducted by the IRS's SBSE, or Small Business Self-Employed Division. Now, once SBSE determines that a return warrants an audit, it's sorted for one of two possible types of audit, a correspondence audit or a field audit. Of the examinations completed in 2015 for small businesses, over half were correspondence audits. A correspondence audit is one that's conducted exclusively by mail. The service center or campus will first mail a standard boilerplate letter to the taxpayer to notify them that they have been selected for examination and to provide them with a list of documents that they will need to provide to be verified. Now, these notices are computer generated. There is virtually no customization with respect to the taxpayer's business, or the issues that may have been the reason that it was selected for examination in the first place. This initial generic request will require the taxpayer to provide a variety of records to the IRS, such as the work papers that were used to prepare the return, the taxpayer's general ledger, bank statements, canceled checks, and deposit slips. A taxpayer must respond within 30 days. They must mail the requested documentation to a general address that is listed on the notice. And should a taxpayer have any questions regarding the initial letter, they are directed to call a general number or write to a general address. Now, once a taxpayer responds, the correspondence is then placed in a queue and then will be assigned to a campus examiner. This process can take months, and sometimes taxpayers are forced to resend the correspondence that they originally sent, as the information that was mailed cannot be located by the IRS. Unfortunately, in many examinations, the quality of a taxpayer's response to the requests that are made by the IRS, as well as the agent's understanding of the position that has been taken by the taxpayer, is impacted by the fact that all the discussions between the two parties are held exclusively through correspondence. Now, field audits, on the other hand, are generally conducted through direct contact with the taxpayer through a combination of face-to-face meetings, telephone calls, and written correspondence. Now, at the outset of one of these audits, the taxpayer will be provided with a request for documents that the agent has identified for review. Now, while these requests are often customized, they also contain boilerplate items that agents are required to seek, regardless of the issues that the agent has identified and regardless of the type of business that the taxpayer is operating. Regardless of the type of the examination that a small business taxpayer receives, establishing good accounting and record keeping will help a taxpayer prepare for an examination should one arise. Now, if one does, it is important to thoroughly and timely review all notices and requests for information that you receive from the service. While the IRS outlines the examination process on its website and in the various publications, for taxpayers, this process can be confusing. Taxpayers are often unsure about what to expect and how to proceed. Now, unlike the Large Business and International, the LB&I division, SBSE does not have a public examination process policy statement whereby the division provides an organizational approach for examinations, from first contact through the final stages of an issue resolution. Nor does it have directives requiring discussions with taxpayers around certain examination procedures, such as the issuance of requests for information or documents. Now, last year, the IRS, including the SBSE, announced its Future State Initiative. Through this initiative, SBSE has indicated that it's looking for ways to find better and more efficient manners of doing business. It has identified possible changes to include the use of digital notifications, possible examination at earlier stages, shortly after returns are filed, the use of limited issue examinations based upon specific aspects of a taxpayer's return, and the ability for taxpayers and their representatives to exchange information electronically with an agent during the examination process. Now, examinations do provide the IRS with an important tool to identify noncompliance. Efforts such as these that have been identified should lead to improvements in the process and help the IRS examine taxpayers more effectively and efficiently. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to provide the committee with this information.
Thank you very much, and we appreciate the testimony of all the members of the panel here, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes to begin the questioning. I'll start with you, Mrs. Perchonchak, if I can. You mentioned that one of your clients didn't even know that a specialist was advising on the audit until a FOIA request was made. How and why would a taxpayer ever need to file a FOIA request to receive information related to their own audit? That sounds pretty outrageous to me.
That's a good question. Let me try to be brief in answering it.
Take as much time as you need.
A strategy used by some controversy professionals would be to file a FOIA request to ensure that they have all the information from the case file, particularly, if they want to ensure they're adequately representing their client in an appeal. So it may be a large issue, or SBSE's work papers aren't quite as thorough as those used by the large business division, so they have a lot of lead sheets. So trying to get all the information and understanding from their file exactly who they were talking to and how they came to conclusions would be very important.
Okay.
They wouldn't get the file unless they asked for it.
And they would not get the file unless they asked for it.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Mr. Hudak, I'll turn to you at this point. What would you identify as the single biggest problem with the IRS exam program as it relates to small businesses, and how would you address it? If there are two that well, there's two, which one? You can take two if you like.
Well, that's a good question. I think third-party contact is a big deal. Increasingly, we're seeing blanket requests to banks, blanket requests to third parties. We're also seeing an increased number of improper contact with taxpayers when a properly executed power of attorney is stopping by to drop off something. The taxpayer says, well, you should give that to my representative. He says, no, that's okay. You can have it. And the question is what was discussed? That's a big problem. But increasingly, the IRS will be using this future state concept where you get a notice, the taxpayer is encouraged to create an online account, and they chat or banter back and forth with the IRS. And if you look at the taxpayer advocates' foldouts on that process and what it looks like, one comes to the realization at some point during that, the taxpayer gets the feeling they're being represented by the IRS. And that's simply not the case. And there's some concern with the IRS's future state as it pertains to representation. I think it can be satisfied in a number of ways. I know NAEA, National Association of Old Agents, has asked to bring back the ability to execute powers of attorney online. We did that before. I think the Office of Chief Counsel seems to think there's a way to do that safely and with confidence.
Thank you very much. I guess similar to that, if I could go back into my earlier career practicing law, I used to handle all kinds of stuff, but one thing was in the domestic relations area. And in Ohio, we have divorces and dissolutions. In a dissolution, it's basically the parties coming in. They usually come in together, but you can't represent as an attorney both parties. You have to be clear. They have to sign one saying, I know he represents this person, not this person. You have the right to get another attorney. So I could see that it's very significant for folks to know that the IRS isn't necessarily your friend, which maybe you instinctively know that when you're born as an American, but certainly when you're dealing with them, you want to make sure you realize they're not representing you. Mr. Williamson, I'll turn to you at this point. What are some of the most persistent concerns you've encountered in your representation of small businesses in the conduct of the exam process? And I know you already dealt with some of them in your statement, and if you want to expound upon those or.
Thank you. It's basically time. This is what really frustrates my clients. In the testimony I gave to you, you were looking at a very simple exchange of information. Had I been able to speak with someone, even on the telephone, I'm sure I could have settled this scenario I just described to you in minutes. Instead, it took a year. And so that's what really frustrates clients is time. Also in small business audits, the agent will show up, begin the audit, walk away, and you don't see him for 6 months. And then suddenly you have presented to you an extension of a statute of limitations. So my clients want to do business, and they want to do it efficiently and as quickly as possible, and they don't need an IRS audit hanging over their heads for 18 months to 2 years when something could be settled very quickly.
My time's almost run out here, but you mentioned before about the person who was being audited and contested it, and by the time they got to the end of it, all the expenses they had far exceeded the amount that the IRS said that they owed, which was wrong. So you're in a situation where even when you win, you lose.
You're absolutely right. I can't tell you how often a client will receive a notice for a few $100s, and to contact me to get a power of attorney, to exchange information, he'll pay it.
Yeah, it shouldn't be like that. It
No, sir.
absolutely shouldn't, and thank you for shedding some light on that. My time has expired. The ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Small businesses are the backbone of America. They are the entrepreneurs and the job creators that are necessary to stimulate our economy. We know that tax compliance is burdensome, but both from a financial and administrative perspective. So in order to be adequately prepared in case of an audit, what's the best practice for a small business when it comes to tax records? Ms. Bring?
Yeah, so as I mentioned a moment ago, I think one of the keys is good accounting and record keeping. But I think that it's also important to maintain those records in real time. Oftentimes, tax returns are prepared after the close of the year, and oftentimes many months after the close of the taxable year. And so it's important that as expenses and items of income are accounted for or recorded, the documentation to support that is kept in real time. When an audit occurs, it often can occur up to 2 to 3 years after the expenditure or the item of income was received. And so therefore, it becomes even harder for a taxpayer to pull together those records. So it's important that those records are maintained in real time and in a way that a taxpayer can access them quickly should an audit occur.
Thank you. Ms. Breen, audits are the primary collection tool for the IRS in their effort to close the tax gap. So what makes this the most attractive tool for the IRS, and how successful is it at recovering unpaid taxes?
Well, I think that it's the most successful tool because it does bring success. And if we look at the statistics that the IRS releases each year about the filing season, last year the IRS reported that in 2015, over $25 billion in total recommended taxes were determined pursuant to that audit cycle. And of that $25 billion, approximately $4 billion was associated with small businesses. As part of the IRS LB&I and SBSE future state, the other operating divisions are announcing other types of treatment streams, so ways that they could identify non-compliance or seek to enforce compliance in other ways outside of the traditional audit. If those are successful, we may see those expand into the SBSE Small Business Division as well.
Thank you. The idea of individualized taxpayer accounts seems to be a popular notion. How could prioritizing accounts of enrolled agents, CPAs, and tax attorneys be helpful to small business clients as it pertains to tax filing and auditing?
Well, the IRS has identified the need to expand its use of technology as a way to enhance the use in examinations and the way that it interacts with the taxpayer. And one of those ways would be to allow taxpayers and their representatives to exchange information electronically with the IRS. Now, these types of abilities could improve the communication between the two parties, and it could help to minimize some of the delays or missing documentation that sometimes occurs when you're communicating with the IRS, and something I think that when any of us are communicating with the IRS, we want to try to avoid.
Okay, but because data security is extremely important, considering the hack of IRS accounts, can you address how we can keep these accounts safe, particularly when these professionals are responsible for assisting small business clients?
Absolutely. I think that it's indisputable that cybersecurity and fraud detection are integral to the IRS's mission of enforcement and service to American taxpayers. The ABA tax section has consistently supported adequate funding of the IRS. We believe that improvements are needed that require substantial investment, and we encourage Congress to provide that sufficient funding so that the service can implement those very important initiatives in the use of technology to better serve taxpayers.
All right, I'm going to yield back my time, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the panelists. I must say I'm somewhat concerned by some of the testimony to date, so I want to follow up, particularly with regard to due process. You know, it was mentioned that in one example, we had a case where a specialist provided insight. IRS said, well, you know, this is the determination, and there's really nothing that I can do about it. My question explicitly is, you know, where are we now in terms of current law on due process, and what recommendations would you have? So, to put a finer point on the question, can the individual, can the small business, for example, call for a face-to-face meeting with all the parties where they can sit down with records and actually sort through? Is that within the Bill of Rights? I mean, is that within the current state of play that that a small business owner can call for such meeting?
No. Basically, in my case I recited to you, there was no right for me to sit down with someone from the Internal Revenue Service and go through these documents until I got to the appeals division, and then they did assign an appeals officer. Until then, in these correspondence audits, it's pretty much back and forth. Now, indeed, after a while in a correspondence audit, there will be someone assigned to the case at the service center, but good luck trying to reach them.
Congressman, I would say that in the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, it talks about the right to be informed. So maybe it doesn't go far enough in the Bill of Rights for the situation I described in my testimony. So when you have, and I use specialists generically, it could be a counsel employee who's advising the agent. It could be a subject matter expert in LB&I from an issue practice group. It could be an engineer, or it could be a technical specialist within SBSE. Whoever that is that's working on the case, it should be more transparent to the taxpayer, and they should be at those face-to-face meetings. I mean, recently I was at a client site, we were having a meeting, and the SBSE agents were doing great jobs interviewing the taxpayer about issues, but there was a specialist that had been involved in the examination, and my understanding is that the specialist, he couldn't come to the interviews. Now, I think it would have been helpful for that specialist to be at the interview to follow up and ask the pertinent questions in making a final decision on that case.
So to understand, there isn't clarity at this point as to what the legal definition of informed means. That's what I'm hearing from the panel at this point.
I would agree with that. I'm not aware that it's.
I would agree with that very much so. I do believe that the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, though, is a document that has to be asserted. And if the representative isn't involved and the practitioner isn't involved, oftentimes the taxpayer's Bill of Rights are not being asserted. The IRS isn't offering this. It has to be asserted from the taxpayer or the representative.
And thank you. And to follow up on your original testimony, which I heard very loud and clear. So if you have a small business owner, they're working, really hard hours. They're just trying to, survive and flourish, and they get this notification of audit. Is it clear when they receive that they have the right to counsel, and that, in other words, the IRS is not their advocate in this? Is that clear?
There's an insert. To the extent they understand the notice in the first place, yes, they are notified, but they're scared. Their records are usually a mess because they're behind a grill 12 hours, and at the end of the day, they've got to reconcile their tips in their credit card machine. Oftentimes, it just doesn't happen. It isn't that they don't care. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with this unique nature of a small business. And I alluded to the safe harbor with the home office deduction. We need to do more things like that to relieve these burdens off of small businesses.
I had one other question, too. It was concerning to me with regard to the notification of third parties. It can be intimidating. It could be friends and colleagues. Is there some kind of provision now for notification at the end of this that there has been a closed case and there has been no discrepancies found?
Congressman, I would say at the end of a case, yes, I think Jennifer addressed in her testimony, there's reports at the end. But with regards to the
Does it go to the third parties, though, that
the
were
third party
notified?
does not get that. It only goes to the taxpayer.
So the onus is really on the taxpayer to say, look, I know you got contacted, but I was cleared. There was no issues. And does the taxpayer get a full listing of all the third parties that were?
They can request a list. I think in the Taxpayer Advocates Report, she addresses the notification process and the requirements in the law that periodically a list should be provided. The IRS has chosen not to provide that periodic list. So unless a taxpayer requests a list, they do not get one.
And I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the witnesses who could be here today, and it's just an honor to talk with you about concerns small businesses have in interacting with the IRS. So, spent a lot of time as a small business owner myself, and would like to continue our track record of not being audited by the IRS, as I think all small business owners would like to do. When that does happen, you have all addressed some concerns about how that process is for the small business owner. And I'm curious if you've been able to discern, how the IRS is measuring the auditors. What are the metrics? Does anyone have that answer?
Congressman, it's been a while since I looked at it, but I think in their performance elements, they're measured on their taxpayer relations, their technical knowledge of a case, and how they conduct the audit. So it would be subjective things that a manager reviews and how they are evaluated.
Technically, since the 90s and some of the scenarios that arose in the 90s, they've made a big deal out of it's not a race to how much revenue each agent can collect versus the other agents. So it's how quickly you can settle your cases and how efficient you are, and not how much revenue you've gained. It's my understanding. I haven't been on the other side of the table myself to know these things.
Okay.
Recently, historically, there were also metrics about case closures. So agents were evaluated on the number of cases they could get closed, and currency was something that was very important. The IRS, with its future state, has announced perhaps it is stepping away from closure as a metric and looking more to cases that have been opened.
Okay, thanks for that. Can anyone answer what the average cost in terms of dollars, hours, and duration in audit is for a small business?
Congressman, as I said in my testimony, I can't specifically say so many dollars. I will simply say it's excessive. If we can communicate with the Internal Revenue Service and show them, in my cases, here are the books, here are the records, what questions you have, let's settle them today. I don't have to have a case on my desk for a year. With 9 out of 10 of my cases is simply documentation. And I can show the IRS the documentation if I can have the meeting or have the telephone call, and we can look at things together.
Okay, and now there are increasingly other factors linked besides just tax compliance for small businesses. And of particular note is Obamacare. And in Congress's appropriations to the IRS, we historically have not funded the IRS specifically to enforce Obamacare, but audits. But the IRS has diverted a significant amount of money to do that. How has that impacted the audit process for small businesses, and how does that relate to the IRS explanations for their ability to turn these things in a timely manner?
Yeah, Obamacare and the returns that are required with it in the 8,000 series have only been around for a couple of years. So I don't think you have an audit history where you can determine how much time is being spent and how the returns are being selected based upon the forms that the taxpayer is filing with respect to their payments of medical care insurance. So we're just not there yet to get a handle on how onerous the audits will be of issues dealing with Obamacare.
In fiscal year 2015, the IRS spent $462 million of its budget on Obamacare enforcement. So somebody must be getting enforced.
Somebody is.
Congressman, the only thing I can say is that when the laws are passed, usually I found that it was a couple of years before you started seeing revenue agents addressing specific issues when the laws were passed. However, there's a lot of work up front with computer systems or with counsel and guidance that go into it. So I can only guess that maybe that's where the money went. But to Mr. Williamson's point, it usually is a few years before you actually start seeing examination activity related to that.
Thank you. Just one last question. I thought it was interesting to say, hey, you actually have to go through the process and note a request, copy of other parties that have been notified. From the small business perspective, are there any other things that we might say, hey, this just ought to be standard practice that you would advise?
Well, I'll start. Obviously, the third-party contact process needs to be looked at closely, and I think Ms. Olson's views on those speak well to that, and if the committee could look at it. The other thing, I wouldn't want to lose fact on the fact-finding part. I mean, we've talked about we send in documents for correspondence, they get lost, but the interactions and the fact-finding, I think the IRS, in looking at their future state, needs to make sure they stay focused on face-to-face interactions with the taxpayer and doesn't move to too much online interaction and expect that to take care of everything.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Ms. Petronchuk, you mentioned in your testimony that the IRS is understaffed, underfunded. And there's a theme here, because the common complaint isn't directed at the IRS or their behavior necessarily, although that. What it sounds like is that they have moved to make their systems accommodate themselves in a way that reflects their ability to respond. So by that I mean, I'm listening to this and I'm thinking that they barely can keep up. I mean, if I were them trying to defend them here, I would say, give us what we need to do this, and we can make sure that special people are there, and that we can answer our phone in less than 45 minutes. You said, Mr. Williamson, and that we didn't get computer-generated things or letters in the mail that were essentially a list of everything. Send us everything you have, and maybe we'll get back to you. So I'd like to, just to be fair in this, because we don't have anybody from the IRS here, I'd like to ask what you think about that conjecture, if it's wrong, and do you think that how much of this do you think is driven by resources as opposed to other things that we've talked about?
Let me just chime in. I want to emphasize that I think most of the panelists will agree with me on this. The professionalism of the individual agents we do business with is very high, and I commend them for that. I think what they've tried to do is, in trying to be more efficient, they become less efficient. And my case was an example of that. Had we just had some communication on one-on-one, I think we could have settled my case literally in minutes rather than a year.
What would they say about that, though? I mean,
I don't know what they would say about it. I know they're making.
It's got to be aggravating for them to get a box of paper in the mail and they have to read it all, or.
You'll have to ask them. I agree wholeheartedly, sir. No question about it. The hours it took us to put this together, to me, would be much, easier for us just to sit down with somebody.
I think the IRS has said, has made statements over and over again that it has a commitment to looking for ways to handle audits more efficiently and effectively. And at the same time, the IRS has been publicly stating that it is doing less with less. That is why the ABA tax section does support adequate funding. On the other hand, you've got small businesses who are also trying to do more with less in many instances. With the IRS's new future state, I think as a practitioner, I would hope that the initiatives that they are coming up with and putting together would create an opportunity for clearer and more effective communication between taxpayers and the IRS, and more focused and efficient audits. I think in that way, both America's small businesses and the IRS can go do the jobs that they want to go do.
Sounds like they're building walls, though, as well. Responding to somebody, or writing to someone in a paragraph and asking for essentially maybe hundreds or thousands of pages. It's easy to do on one's end, but it's impossible to respond to on the other.
Absolutely. And many instances where the letters that are sent to taxpayers that contain that perhaps brief or cryptic information or request is computer generated. So no human being is actually looking at that letter or looking at that return once it's first selected and saying, hey, let's look at X, Y, and Z, and let's ask these very specific questions to the taxpayer.
So you think it's been dumbed down to the point where it's easier to ask a big question that requires a lot of work than ask a simple question that requires homework?
I think because the computer is issuing these letters in the beginning, it's giving you a boilerplate list. Taxpayers have no idea what it is they're supposed to give. They do the best they can. They send it in and hope that someone looks at it.
What do you think? You were there 29, 28 years?
Yeah, I was.
You must have made a lot of enemies in that time.
Yeah, I'm sure. Most people like revenue agents. I think they said most of them professional. There are cultural problems at the IRS. It's not all funding. Yes, funding would help. They could do things. Maybe they need training. Just third-party contacts as a cultural issue. They could do something with training, revising the procedures for that to fix it. I talked about the use of specialists. Yes, more specialists would help them if they really want to have a specialist on a case, devote their resources, but maybe they work fewer cases if they don't have the specialist and it requires that type of resource instead of opening it up and not being fair to taxpayers during that exam.
We've heard a lot of comments from NAEA's members about disappearing auditors, going away on detail, going away on training, disappearing for 6 months. Increasingly, they're working from home, telecommuting. The question is with the security. I understand they're doing that to keep costs down, but at the end of the day, you know, they're carrying taxpayer information home with them, and there's a concern there. But I think it's all being driven by the same budget issue that we've been discussing today.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. I want to thank everybody for being here today. We've heard a number of problems. Some might describe it as an epidemic to small business, the exam process, that is. These issues need to be addressed, and I hope that today's hearing is a good first step in our ensuring that that happens. I want to thank you all again for being here. I appreciate the effort of our distinguished panel in bringing these issues to light. Sunshine is essential for change. All too frequently, taxpayers are hesitant to take the IRS to task publicly for fear of their situation may actually get worse. Can't blame them for that. So these problems persist. Creating an environment where we can identify, discuss, and take these issues head-on is a key goal of this committee, and I especially want to thank our witnesses again for working to achieve that goal. If there are no comments by, ma'am, would you like to have a closing statement?
Just to thank you all very much. It's been very insightful, and we appreciate the opportunity to hear from you.
Thank you. This committee hearing is adjourned. Okay.